Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. It's great to see you. And I'm super happy you're enjoying it. This is our first state policy showcase that River Network is doing, and this is something we're going to be doing every other month. And really is in response to the network and hearing from you guys that like state policy is great to connect on this. We've thought so for a long time too, so we're really glad to be able to put this in place, regardless of what sort of administration we have at the federal level. The state policy is always really important to be sort of a beacon of what's happening sort of in a progressive way and be able to share that out. So, and we're starting today, of course, with the human right to water, which is a super important, timely topic right now, and is aligns with one of our priority issues at River Network of achieving safe and affordable drinking water. So happy to be able to focus this on today. So I'm going to provide a short introduction before I hand it over to Amanda and Jorge, our speakers today. Really pleased to be with us. And so the flow of our call today will be, we'll hear from Jorge and Amanda about what's happening in their states of California and Virginia. And we'll have time for Q&A, but really save a lot of time for discussion and exchange with all of you to find out, take your questions, see what's happening in your state, see how this might apply where you are. So we are looking forward to it. And once again, welcome and thanks for joining us. So I didn't introduce myself, but I am Catherine Bear, or often go by KB, and my pronouns are she, her, and I live in Carborough, North Carolina, which are the traditional homelands of the Eno, Shakori, and Catawba people, who are the original caretakers of this land where I now live. And so we would love to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, and feel free to add your pronouns, organizations, and lands where you live now, if you feel comfortable doing so, and so we can all know who's here and on the call with us today. And also I would say that I am here with my colleague, April Engel, who's also in North Carolina, and April's the one who was the primary lead in organizing this, so a big shout out to her for doing that, and you'll hear from April more later. So just a little bit of background before I hand it over to our speakers today. So we are talking about the human right to water. And, I think the human right to water has become sort of a cry in a lot of ways, and we use it in a lot of different ways now. And we talk about making sure we get access to more people in a really critical way. It was, this term has sort of a real meaning that originated from the United Nations, though, I would say, and it was who first adopted the human right to water as a resolution in 2010 to address poverty reduction and sustainable development. And the resolution declared that safe and clean water and sanitation are a human right. And this was defined by earlier work of another UN committee stating that the human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. And they further sort of explained that, talking about the human right to water is indispensable for leading a life of human dignity. And so really framed this in this human right context, which is something we don't always think about in the United States. So as the UN has further defined some of these terms and sort of clarified what it means, they don't necessarily mean that water is free, but just that it's affordable. And they've called on to actually sort of operationalize this right by providing capacity, enacting through their legal systems, policies. And some countries have done this in some ways. The United States has not. And so that's where then we come to today, where some states, like California, have already adopted it, and other states like Virginia are in the process. So we have this international sort of concept that is then starting to be applied. There are calls to apply it nationally as well, but we're really focusing on the state today. So this is important human right to water, and we're really curious about how it can be enrolled at the state, what it means, what it might look like in your state. So with that said, I am going to introduce Amanda and Jorge. So first of all, welcome to them both. Jorge Aguilar is the Southern Region Director and oversees Food and Water Watch's campaigns in the Southeast region. He's worked to defeat major water privatization projects in Florida and led the successful legislative campaign in Maryland to ban the use of arsenic in chicken production. By working with local coalition partners and volunteers, he's continuing to fight against the unsustainable factory farm system and the dangers associated with fracking. He previously worked as a labor organizer for SEIU in Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia, and has an MA in communications from the University of Florida. Amanda Monaco works as a policy coordinator for water programs at the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, and she helps communities organize and fight for their rights to equitable access to drinking water and wastewater services and sustainable groundwater management. She's from Gainesville, Florida, and attended the University of Florida, where she got her BA in political science. She received her law degree from Georgetown, where she studied human rights, environmental, corporate, and trade law. Before working with the Leadership Council, she was an ally for communities fighting environmental injustices in Latin America and with several nonprofits based in Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. So super happy to have our colleagues here with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to them. I'm going to stop sharing. All right, so Jorge, hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Catherine. Yeah, so hello again, everybody. Yeah, my name is Jorge, and I go by he, him pronouns. I am actually in Washington, D.C. right now. So it's the lands of the Anacostan and the Piscataway. And yeah, as was said earlier, work with Food and Water Watch, which is a national environmental organization that works to make sure that we have safe, affordable water, and also safe quality food, as well as staving off the worst impacts of climate change. So we do a lot on energy. So it is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the River Network for inviting me, and I think they sort of saw the news about this great resolution declaring water a human right in Virginia and kind of put this together. And I'm also looking to learn more about sort of next steps in what happened in California, and maybe hear from y'all about some of the work that you've been doing too. And so what I wanted to kind of present and break down the presentation into three parts, to talk a little bit about sort of the context of how this came to be in Virginia, just like sort of what led up to it. You can imagine what 2020, what everybody was focusing on, but there were some other little things in there. The second part is just sort of looking at the language in the resolution and sort of important components in the language that we're going to follow up with. And then finishing off with a little bit about what we're thinking in Virginia about next steps. But that's sort of like to, I think, segue into the conversation that Amanda's going to talk about and when we open it up for conversation. So from the very get-go, I'm going to put in the language. This might, let me hold off between it before I share the language with y'all to give you the context first, because if not, I know you're going to read through the language and like break down all the policy, like good policy analysts that you are. But I'll start off with my background. I am actually originally from Nicaragua, immigrated to the US, and part of my motivation for doing the work that I do at Food and Water Watch has been just to really see some of the issues I've seen just with my family in Nicaragua, right? Emerging economy, if you will. Often have family members don't have access to water 2 or 3 times a week. And it has been shocking as I grow into, get older in age and in adulthood to recognize that there's a lot of places in the US that have problems with access to water. And so that's what motivates me really to continue doing the work, and found that Food and Water Watch has really been on the front lines of water access, water scarcity, and kind of fighting just generally water affordability. So I start off that to give you context, because really in 2020, Food and Water Watch was focusing a lot of energy on and resources towards a national moratorium on water shutoffs. So I'm sure a lot of y'all were also working on that. So this was even during the Trump administration. Was not really voicing a lot of concern about this, even though it was like #1 sort of advice for preventing COVID from spreading was washing your hands. So focused on that, but focused also on a lot of states and pushing state executives to issue their own moratorium. At its height, about 20 states had some sort of like shut-off moratorium that protected 60% of people. Of course, a lot of those have ended. It's a continuing national work. In Virginia specifically, a shut-off moratorium was declared, but it officially only applied to regulated utilities. which in Virginia just really meant private ones. And the private ones, the private utilities in Virginia were very few. So the governor, his name is Governor Northam, had generally said, look, this moratorium applies to everyone, but there were still a lot of questions in several local jurisdictions as to whether shutoffs were in place or not. So right, we're getting back to like, was water accessible in Virginia in 2020 for everyone? And we were uncertain that there were a couple places that wasn't the case. But in special session, actually, so the special session in Virginia took place in late July. The issue of water did become a part of the big debate around the moratorium, not just on water, but across all utilities, right? Like energy, electric, gas. And the sponsor, who played a huge role, I want to give a shout out to Delegate Aird, the sponsor of the eventual resolution that passed of the human right to water, actually filed a bill to put a moratorium on water shutoffs. So she was very much a leader on that fight. In the end, a shutoff was established that put a moratorium on all utility shutoffs, but under a plan where customers had to set up a payment plan over a period of time with each company. So it wasn't straightforward, right? It was this kind of payment plan that really put a lot of onus on customers to move forward and establish that. It's House Bill 5005. There's $100 million in sort of relief funds from the stimulus package, you all recall from last year, that's meant to be used to protect those utility customers. I'll add this, again, this is still in the context. This is what was going on in really the summer of 2020 before we kind of adopted the idea of this resolution. So Food and Water Watch actually just came out with a report with Cornell that found that in Virginia alone, researchers estimated that almost 15,000 COVID infections could have prevented if there had been a statewide moratorium in place throughout the study period. Nationally, it found that 500,000 cases could have been avoided and 9,000 deaths. So again, this is like a real focus for us. So that was one thing going on, was the shutoffs. Second thing was, Food and Water Watch has been very concerned about privatization of water utilities. So corporations taking over the running of the water utility. Today, 85% of Americans get their water from public utilities, but what we've seen is that even pre-pandemic, a lot of utilities are struggling to modernize and repair their systems because of lack of funds. And what we see is large corporations kind of promise that they have this influx of cash where they can just come into a city and say, look, we can, or a county, and say, we can address a lot of these concerns. So we'd seen it in a city called Petersburg in the past few years. In a place right now, there's a city called Cape Charles that's thinking of privatizing. And I've actually worked with several communities in Virginia who've already privatized, who have tons of issues and have tried to address high costs, poor quality service, poor water quality, and it's been an uphill battle. So we always try to think about how we ensure water access, quality, and maintenance is provided by public utilities. So in this time of, like huge economic kind of crunch and collapse, we see cities that are really under a lot of pressure. And because of that, it leads to higher water rates potentially, and lots of other issues where, again, we are seeing this threat of privatization happening. So this is what was going on. Again, I was saying early summer, late spring. So we had a lot of conversations with our main partner, who may have just joined, the Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, which is a faith group with many ties to the environmental justice movement in Virginia, to discuss how we could address some of these water issues. And the IPL have been huge partners on the national utility shutoffs. A lot of the original conversations around access, affordability, and really preparing to fight what comes post-pandemic, right? Like what is going to be happening. We brought to the table the fact that in Baltimore, right, so not too far away, Food and Water Watch has been working on a 4-year campaign to ensure water access via an ordinance that calls for water rates to be based on income levels. So it's something that we've been working on, and we fear that that might be the future in Virginia, where the lack of affordability is something we gotta really talk about. So in our conversations with the Interfaith Power and Light, we talked about an education campaign on the human right to water. And where we left it off at is actually, I did a lot of research on sort of seeing where California was at and a couple other states to kind of come up with the language. And I gotta again, give a lot of credit to Interfaith Power and Light, because they were the ones really talking to a couple of their legislative champions, and really is where we found Delegate Aird, who was really on board with the concept of this declaration. And basically we kind of like worked through some language, and Delegate Aird took it from there. She pre-filed the bill after tweaking a couple of things here and there. And the legislation, I think, was pre-filed in November of last year. So two big pieces that were really influential, though, right off the get-go, was that the state NAACP endorsed the legislation because they were fighting alongside a lot of other racial and economic justice bills that were filed in session. So in fact, Delegate Aird not only did the water, the human right to water resolution, she did another resolution saying that racism is a public health emergency. So there's just a lot of sort of energy behind sort of this like really social justice, economic justice, even water access sort of push in the session in Virginia, which I should say the Virginia session runs from January to about mid-February. And the Virginia Black Caucus, a series of legislators also got behind it. So that's sort of the context. Now I'm going to share the bill. And April, like, tell me if I'm, there's so much to talk about. I'm trying to like rush through it. And I know it's a lot of me talking here, so I'm trying my best to kind of like narrow it down. But the bill I just shared, and you see, it is a non-binding resolution, right? So that's one of the key questions. Is it non-binding? So what comes next? But I wanted to highlight sort of five main points. So in the first whereas, you will see that there's mentioned there that water is a public trust and not a commodity. Lots of y'all have probably heard there are corporations trying to create markets for water where it is to be publicly traded. And so that's a big concern, and we wanted that to be in there. In the second whereas, you see that it says UN says the cost of water should be no higher than 3 to 5% of income, of a person's income. So again, that's kind of based off of the UN sort of package that they passed in 2010, which Food and Water Watch actually, our board chair did a lot of work too with the UN and getting some of that. So this is where some of this is coming from for us. So third point I'll make, in item number 2 under it shall be resolved, you see that it says ensuring that water is a priority for domestic use over commercial interests. So again, another one of these things where we're making sure that humans, have better access than a lot of these other issues in Virginia, where there is a sense that there may be an incoming water scarcity because of the depletion of our aquifer by industry. Fourth point, I'll make item number 4. Cost should not be a hindrance to access to water, right? Back to that point of just because someone can't afford it should not mean they don't have access to it. And then we get to, the key one probably that sets up for our next conversation, which is item number 6, where it says state agencies are strongly encouraged to take into account that water is a human right. So there was an amendment on this one, because originally the bill said state agencies shall consider. So it was a shall. Instead, it became are strongly encouraged. So that was a change. In the end, we accepted it because it was still all non-binding. But it's a good segue to the questions we have before us as to how we make sure then that they do consider it and that we do actually guarantee it. So it's not just a symbolic resolution. So this is where the next steps section comes along. So what Interfaith Power and Light and Food and Water Watch had really talked about is really, and this is like in this hopefully post-pandemic reality and universe, where we want to launch more of an educational campaign over the next year to collect more stories and tell them about the opportunities that this particular resolution opens up. One way we see right off the bat that might be something we can take advantage of is that there is federal money coming via the latest stimulus package. It does include relief assistance for some states. So we've had conversations as Food and Water Watch about how we make sure cities can tap into that, and that it is highlighted as something that's needed, not just in this bill, but potentially in this bigger infrastructure package that has been talked about under the Biden administration. Food and Water Watch is also working on a federal bill called the Water Act, which has 50 co-sponsors that would provide $35 billion a year to drinking water and wastewater improvements. And the idea here is that the funding mechanism is to roll back one of the Trump tax cuts to create money. We're right now focused on making sure that a lot of the elements in this Water Act go into that federal infrastructure plan that I just mentioned from Biden. So that's sort of right off the bat. We still have to talk about with our champion Delegate Aird and some of the other legislators who were really crucial in passing this, about how we can get the state to really ensure that piece of funding, but that it considers state agencies our general water use. And so we have some ideas about that. We can go on a little more about that, but there's again something where we could come up with new funding, like some sort of funding measures to create a kind of independent water trust fund. So there's that, or there's this income-based ordinances that I talked a little bit about from Baltimore, and that's more of a city by city kind of a plan. So that's sort of where we're at right now, figuring it out. But we really are really proud to have worked on this Virginia Human Right to Water Declaration, and to join, I think it's only 3 other states that have it, but are really looking to see how California kind of took next steps after they passed their resolution to make it a more real thing that actually improves people's lives. So yeah, I think that's sort of what I had, and I'm happy to turn it over to Amanda, and I'll take any questions. Yeah, after that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. That was great. Let's move on to Amanda, and then we'll take questions for everyone, for both of you at the same time. And everyone feel free to put your questions into the chat as they come up as well.
Great, thanks KB, and thanks Jorge. That presentation, it just spurred so many things in my mind that I now want to talk to you about. It's fine. Yeah, we'll have a chance to talk about them later, which is going to be great. Good conversation. So first, I'm going to figure out how to share my screen. Okay. Okay, share. Okay, can everyone see the presentation? Great. Okay, so I don't know why that happened. Okay, so as KB and April already said, my name is Amanda Monaco. I work with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. I'm one of our water policy coordinators, and my pronouns that I use are she and her. I'm based in Fresno, California, which is kind of the smack dab middle of the state for those of y'all who don't know California as well. And I'm on Yokuts territory here in the San Joaquin Valley. So I'm going to talk, now that Jorge has kind of talked about how the human right to water was passed in Virginia, which was really fascinating to hear about, I'm going to talk about how the human right to water was passed in California and what impacts it's had and kind of where we need to go from here. So first, to give a little bit of background about Leadership Council and our community partners. So we are a community-based environmental justice organization. So we work alongside about 30 low-income communities of color, mostly rural farm worker communities in the San Joaquin Valley, kind of the central part of California in the eastern Coachella Valley, which is inland of LA, basically. And folks that we work with, they work with us on, we work with folks on a whole range of issues that really have to do with a lack of investment in low-income communities of color that has created a pattern where folks that we work with really don't have critical, basic infrastructure in their communities that they need to be healthy and safe communities, lacking clean drinking water, reliable drinking water supply, transportation infrastructure, air quality issues, transportation, roads issues, housing issues, land use issues. I think I've covered all the areas that we work in, but essentially folks, we work on anything having to do with infrastructure and investment that folks want to work on in their community. And we use three main tools. One, organizing. So we help folks come together around the issues that are most important to them and have conversations and decide what they want to do. We use legal advocacy if we've tried to do policy advocacy and that hasn't worked and we need to sue someone. And the third thing that we use is policy advocacy. So we help folks directly go to their representatives, participate in agency meetings around policy processes that impact their lives and issues that they care about. So these are some snapshots of folks that we work with, talking to representatives in Sacramento, talking amongst themselves in community meetings, partying at their houses. We work with a lot of really, really wonderful people, and I'm grateful to do the work. So I'm gonna do the opposite of what Jorge did. I'm gonna show the human right to water first and then get into how it was passed, and I will pass this slide later so you won't be stuck on the policy analysis. But I wanted to bring a couple things to light regarding the human right to drinking water in California. So this is the language. It was passed in 2012. It was AB 685. And it was a section that was added to the water code to read the following. So I'm going to highlight two sections. So first, it generally talked about what the human right to water is. So it's the established policy of the state that every human being has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water adequate for human consumption, cooking, and sanitary purposes. So the phrases that we kind of chant as our mantra throughout the rest of time after the human right to water in California is the safe, clean, and affordable. That became like the drinking water mantra, right? So when we're talking about drinking water, we really make sure that those three elements are a part of the conversation in local advocacy and state advocacy, what have you. And then, so that's the concept, right? That's the concept of what the human right to water is. And I think partially that was derived from the UN human right to water definition. But how is this, who does this actually bind? You'll see some similarities to what Jorge was saying in Virginia, but all relevant state agencies, so any state agencies that are dealing with things having to do with water, shall consider, we got the shall consider, I guess, this state policy when revising, adopting, or establishing policies, regulations, and grant criteria when those are pertinent to uses of water described in the section. So it requires state agencies to consider the human right to water. That had a lot of, there was a lot of fighting about that before the law was passed, and since there's been a lot of different interpretations about what that means. It is not as binding as we would prefer, because an agency could ostensibly say, hey, we considered it and we decided not to prioritize that. But in the spirit of the law, we really, in our advocacy and what residents that we work with want to see is that state agencies are taking this seriously and prioritizing the human right to water in their decision making. So that's what it is. And the other sections, I'm not going to go into those because we have limited time. So how did we pass this human right to water? Full disclosure, I was not doing water policy work in California in 2012 or the years preceding the adoption of the human right to water. So I got all this information from a few folks that I talked to who were intimately involved in that process. So there are some gaps in my knowledge, but I'll, in question answer, I can kind of answer whatever I can. But to give a brief overview of the big things that made this pass, first of all, it took 3 years to pass. So the first piece of legislation I was involved in, which I'll mention later, it didn't pass in the first year, and I was discouraged, and I thought that meant that we were never going to get it. But sometimes you just need to build the momentum and build the education about why this is important, because one of the big things about the human right to drinking water in California was that we did the coalitions and the organizations and the residents who are working on this did a ton of education about how widespread drinking water issues were in California, how water was not safe to drink, how folks' wells were going dry, and how the cost of water was really unaffordable. So there's a lot of education, consistent education in the media, in meetings, agency meetings, et cetera, et cetera. Third, I'll mention that there was a huge statewide coalition that was made up of environmental organizations, public health organizations, drinking water advocates. So that was kind of the nonprofit side. But then the nonprofits worked and residents worked really effectively with faith-based coalitions. So that was interesting to me that Jorge was also saying that they worked with a faith-based coalition, because we did as well. And that the faith-based coalitions were really critical in spreading the movement and growing the movement and getting more just individuals in California aware of issues, drinking water issues, and supporting the human right to drinking water. And then finally, last but definitely not least, community power really drove support of the law. So it was residents' testimonies, residents' expertise about what the issues were that educated folks and that drove actually the final vote. Michael Rubio was a representative from the Central Valley, and it was his critical vote that was needed to pass this bill. And because he was listening to the residents in his district area, that's why he voted in favor, and that's what ended up tipping the scale and passing the bill. There were a couple substance issues. Large water systems were opposed to the concept of affordability because they were worried that that would mean that they couldn't do water shutoffs, which they saw as critical to their operations, which now no one can ever say that. Again, I mean, it's just not accepted for that to even be an argument from water systems anymore in California. And then there was another liability piece where the agricultural industry was worried about their responsibility as far as how the ways that they use water and impact water, whether they would be seen as responsible, which I'm sorry, they are, for polluting drinking water and pumping too much drinking water and making wells go dry. So they were worried about that. And then the second kind of big substance piece was the importance, convincing folks of the importance of the human right to water, even though it didn't have a clear mandate, even though it just says the state agencies shall consider, but showing folks, legislators and the public, that it's really important to pass this baseline law so that we can progress as a state. And finally, due to all of that effort and education and information and debate about the substance, it was really apparent in the last hearings and the last votes on the bill that the clear message from the community was heard. So we heard legislators saying talking about residents' testimonies, talking about how widespread these drinking water issues were. And it was very clear that the power of the people and the information and expertise of residents had gotten to the legislators, and they were basing their votes on that. That was really powerful to hear. So that's a bit about how the movement was built. Now I'm going to transition into the impacts of the human right to water law in California. This is a picture of Carolina Garcia, who lives in one of the communities that we work with, and her daughter, Natalie. And all of this has been very critical for them because it allowed them to have access to drinking water in their home. So the first impact of the human right to water in California is that there's more funding and work on getting adequate drinking water infrastructure in low-income communities of color and low-income communities in general. So in 2014, voters approved Prop 1 funding for drinking water infrastructure, and that was partially because of all the momentum that was built leading up to the human right to water passage in California. So that's a bond. It's not a consistent source of funding. But nonetheless, that was approved, and that was very important. Then SB 88 was passed in 2015. So there's really two agencies in California that are in charge of water. There's the State Water Board and the Department of Water Resources, and the State Water Board was given the ability to say if there was a small community that had really unreliable drinking water, their wells were going dry, or they had contaminated water, the state water board could come in and tell a nearby city to consolidate and connect that community to their larger water system so that they would have a reliable water source. So that was very important and has been used in many cases in communities that we work with, and is being used where Carolina lives. Lastly, under this impact, I'll mention SB 200, which was just passed in 2019, which created a reliable and inclusive source of drinking water infrastructure funding. So Prop 1 was not a super consistent source of funding, and this created a much more reliable source of funding for drinking water infrastructure, installing drinking water treatment plants, consolidations, and funding also for ongoing operations and maintenance of those facilities. Next, there's 6 impacts. I'm gonna try to get through them in a reasonable amount of time. So next was drinking water affordability. AB 401 was passed in 2015, and that created a process for making a statewide water affordability program. So it's 2021 now, and it's kind of insane that it's taken this long, but they're still in the process of figuring out what kind of a tiered rate structure would look like. There are affordability programs already in the state for energy, so they're thinking of modeling it off of that income-based program. Next, there's generally increased transparency around drinking water quality, at least, and now more supply issues. The State Water Board created what's called the Human Right to Water portal. There's a picture of it here on the right of the slide. Basically, you can type in your water system or your city and see whether your city's water system has a violation of any of the drinking water quality standards. And it has all of the records of any past violations and how those have been remediated. So it really increased transparency about drinking water pollution in the state. Next, in general, there have been some institutional culture changes. So the State Water Board, that same agency, adopted a Human Right to Water resolution, which says kind of how they're going to implement the human right to water in their actions as a state agency, which has had a lot of ripple effects in the processes that they follow in their day-to-day operations. And now the Department of Water Resources, which is the other important state water agency, has begun their own process for their own human right to water protocol, which will do something similar. Last two, the human right to water has kind of helped definitely lead to enhanced water resource management. So I know in a lot of states, the main water issues, a lot of states in the East, the main water issues are water quality. So contamination of water. In California, we have a huge problem with, I'm not gonna say it's water scarcity, but water supply. Like the region where I live, the San Joaquin Valley, it's a semi-desert, so there's not a ton of water to start out with, but it's also one of the most agriculturally productive regions of the country. So you have a ton of water use by the agricultural industry, which has led to a situation where folks who are on domestic wells or shallower community wells, those wells are going dry because the water in the aquifers is just lower and lower and lower, and a lot of wells are going dry. So in 2014, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed, and that created a framework for protecting groundwater and creating more sustainable groundwater use. And generally, there's been a shift in the framing of the dialogue around drinking water issues. Every time anyone brings up the importance of drinking water, tries to minimize the importance of drinking water, advocates and residents can always say, wait, in the state of California, we have all declared that there is a human right to drinking water, and drinking water has to be safe, reliable, and affordable. So it's no longer in question that is a #1 priority of the state. So we still have far to go. There's kind of 4 main issues. We still need to really protect drinking water supply. We really need to get a handle on our groundwater use and making sure that wells don't go dry. We need to prevent pollution and protect drinking water quality better. That's a huge issue, and it's kind of, the state has a really piecemeal approach on how that's done. There needs to be more political will and local accountability to push solutions forward. Even if you have state funding and state authority to push consolidations, you still need the local actors to get on board. And one big gap kind of in the human right to water law is that it's not clear what the local agency's responsibility is to guaranteeing the human right to water. And lastly, ensuring affordability. So we're still going through that AB 401 process and need to come up with a way to make sure that bills are really going to be affordable for all residents. So that's it. That's my presentation, and glad to open up the conversation and answer any questions.
That's great, Amanda. Thank you so much. Really so interesting to hear about what's going on in both these states. So yeah, let's take some questions. I've got one starting from Hannah, who was asking about, I think in the California law, we talked about what are the other relevant state agencies and whether those are defined somewhere else, which agencies might those be?
Oops, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, so it was a question from Hannah about what are the other state agencies that are really engaged in this. I think the law says something about other relevant state agencies, and so which agencies those are.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that is a very good question. We mostly focus, I mean, my work really is focused on what the State Water Board and the Department of Water Resources are doing. But when thinking about other decisions that state agencies are making, like land use decisions or ways that they're impacting the way that local agencies are doing development, they should also be taking water resources into account, right? Like making sure that general plans, that local land use planning agencies are factoring water use in when they're doing their development and housing allocations. So, so that could extend to a lot of different agencies. Sorry, I can't, don't have a better answer off the top of my head.
Good. Yeah, definitely feel free to come off mute if you'd like to just ask a question or comment or put it in the chat. And then April, I'll hand it over to you for our next part whenever you're ready.
Are there any more questions for Jorge or Amanda?
I had posted a question earlier in the presentation about if there were precedents for other communities who have set water rates based on income level, and like curious if those currently exist or if it's mostly like in process right now for that becoming a new precedent, or like if there are any models of where it's worked successfully even outside of the US.
Yeah, hey, so I could talk about that. So as far as I know, the first place that really adopted an income-based rate system was Philadelphia. So they have a current one. I think they're a year and a half or two into it. So as far as I know, it's working well. We actually worked with somebody that kind of helped put it together, but I haven't followed it like it's closely recently, so I can't give you the real sort of answer to that one, because the one that I mentioned was something Food and Water Watch rolled out in Baltimore, which is taken 2.5 years to kind of get adopted, and now we're in the implementation phase. So for all of these, it's like you kind of like passed the law and now it's the implementation. So Baltimore had a ton of shutoffs. This is like 4 years ago. It was like a real crisis. And then that led to then the city taking people's property to pay off for some bills. So they had the power to use eminent, was not eminent domain necessarily, but they just had the power to take property even from businesses. So we started even working with faith leaders. So some churches, some pastors lost their churches. And what we found was often it wasn't even because they couldn't pay their bills, but there were lots of issues with the billing system. So the ordinance that passed not only addressed the rate-based I'd say, amendments and changes, but also accountability, just because the billing system, and that's still ongoing in Baltimore. But the third place that's actually, I think, about to adopt it is Chicago. And so we're also working on that a little bit. So I do think it's kind of a new way of thinking about it. And that's why I kind of highlighted this real idea that I think we have to make sure, we educate folks about it, and legislators about 3 to 5% of one's income is really what rate should be set at, as per what the UN has sort of given out as guidance.
Thanks for that answer. I'll check out the rate-based one in Philly.
So you all are welcome to continue to ask Amanda and Jorge questions as we continue on here, but I also wanted to just open up discussion now with all of you. We have 26 people in the meeting, so I invite all of you, or at least those of you who want to come off of mute and or type in the chat, but I'd love to just get your thoughts on, as you've listened to these really important examples that Amanda and Jorge shared with us, to hear like what windows of opportunity you might look for in your state when it comes to moving human right to water legislation forward. And also, I'd love to just hear if there's barriers or roadblocks that you think you might encounter, and strategies that you might be thinking of that you've learned from Jorge and Amanda about what you might use to sort of move around those barriers. So I know that all of you on the call have lots of great experience also, so would love to just open it up for some discussion, invite folks to share a little bit about what your experiences are working on this policy.
Hi, this is Faith Harris from Virginia, North Carolina. How are you?
Good, thanks.
I actually had a question to Amanda about, and we're the organization that worked with Food and Water Watch with Jorge for the legislation here. But I had a question about, because I have believed that this is going to be a challenge for us as we go forward, on how you address the issue, how California addressed the issue with the agricultural lobbyists and entities. How did you overcome that? Because that, I know, is they have a lot of power in our state. In most states where ag is king.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know. That is an ongoing issue, honestly. Apparently ag, so as I said, I wasn't around when the Human Right to Water law was passed, but the ag lobbyists wanted a statement in the Human Right to Water law that talked about the importance of growing food. And luckily that was not, or fortunately that was not included in the bill, but that kind of goes towards, like, they're so powerful that even at the state level on this law that's like not really related to growing food or agriculture, they were trying to insert that language. And they talked about it for a while. So I'm really engaged on regionally and on the local level in more local water management decisions. And they're really, really strong. I think a couple things that have been really key though in spreading awareness about the kind of trade-offs between water use by ag and other users and the way that agriculture impacts water has been academia and research. So research and publication of really tight, well-researched reports has been really critical in changing the dialogue. For example, the SB 200, which I mentioned in my presentation, which created that more consistent funding for drinking water infrastructure, that was actually, the conversation about that bill started because there was a report from UC Davis, which is a really well-known institution here, about how it was very clear that nitrate contamination in drinking water was mostly from agricultural and dairy operations. So it no longer was a question, and you couldn't refute that anymore. And that started the conversation about, well, then how, knowing agriculture is responsible for that, how are we going to deal with that, and how are we going to make sure to hold them responsible? So I think that that's been a really key tool in advocacy, is just having that clear information and engaging academic institutions in that. And Juliet adds talk, because I know Juliet Christian Smith from Water Foundation is here as well. So she has some expertise as well in this.
Well, I was just going to say that the state regulatory body, the State Water Board, sent out enforcement letters after that report to particularly dairies and other sources of nitrogen, and that helped them see the writing on the wall. And they were actually supportive of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund in the end, and agreed to a tax on fertilizers, which didn't end up in the final bill, but they did get on the right side of things due to the science and the imminent threat of enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for adding that.
Yeah, thank you. I was also wondering about related to how use, right? You know, the conversation or the notion of drying up wells, particularly in areas where there's like big ag and lots of people on wells. And I'm just wondering if there are, I guess I was thinking about the idea of possibly like providing some alternative watering systems, you know, suggestions for that. I know that many are using the new systems, but that are a lot less, that use a lot less water, and trying to encourage that, especially with small farmers, and what, you know, whether there's any push anywhere to help farmers, you know, acquire that kind of, you know, equipment. Especially for small farms. I would imagine the larger ones are already doing it. But.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there have been some, I would say probably local irrigation districts are promoting that more than the state. But in general, I mean, one big controversy in California is also how we use surface water. So the north of the state is really has a lot more water than the central and southern part of the state, and just the way the water flows, it's kind of captured and then carted around the state through canals, and that has been, the agricultural interests have really lobbied hard to get more of that water. That's also becoming another issue. But so we've got water conservation, which needs to be better, really needs to be better. The kind of crops they're growing in the San Joaquin Valley, they're growing almonds in a semi-desert, and it really doesn't make sense. But there's a lot of incentives at play here, right? Because they can get more surface water if they want it, sometimes. And also there's kind of this justification that's used, which I'm sure you're seeing as well, that it's not just agriculture versus drinking water. The agricultural interests usually say, we're not just using water for profit, we're providing an economy, and find this huge value to that. And I think if we could quantify that value and compare it to the actual impact on people's lives, that would could be a lot more powerful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I feel you, Faith, I feel you, because that is a problem here as well.
Thank you, Faith, for a great question. Other questions, insights, or experiences that anybody else would want to share? We have a few more minutes to at least hear from one more person, so I'd love for somebody else to come off mute and share a question, an insight, an experience that to add to the discussion today. Okay, Well, we do have just a few more minutes, and so I'm
The
gonna.
question on the chat, April.
Oh, good. Okay, great. So Hannah's asking, are there any examples for how foreign companies have been affected or regulated by the human right to water resolutions, thinking about Line 5 in Michigan? And Hannah, I don't know if you want to come off mute and say a little bit more about Line 5 in Michigan. I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. I don't know if others are as well.
Yeah, so Line 5 is a Canadian-owned oil and gas pipeline that runs through the Straits of Mackinac, and there have been groups trying to have it shut down and removed from the Great Lakes for a number of years. And it's culminated in like a really interesting standoff between our state government, who has ordered a foreign company to shut it down, and them saying that they won't comply. And I'm just curious if there are other states with like large foreign operators in them that have seen any give or take on issues like that because of these resolutions, or if there are any attempts at doing so, because that would be a great tool to have in addition to everything that's happened over like the last 10 years, honestly, regarding this pipeline.
Thanks, Hannah.
Hey, so I would say, although it's not necessarily related to the declaration, the water is kind of the number one thing. Maybe not number one, that's not fair, but access to water and ensuring water supply, I think is really a top message in a lot of like the energy fights, like that, be it pipelines. But when you mentioned that, the one I thought of has been just a big movement against the bottled water industry. So for instance, Nestle, which is apparently sold part of its business to sort of a international company, like a foreign company, I believe, where it's in the process of that. There's a lot of fights in Michigan, for instance, around Nestle, in Maine and Florida, where, yeah, right, this is where places giving away their water for, I mean, in Florida, it was like a permit was like $200, and that's it. And they could take all the water they wanted. So I know that's been, I mentioned it as a message to really move a lot of folks who may not, care about a fossil fuel company per se, but do understand the value of like preserving control over water and ensuring future generations have access to the water instead of giving it away to a company like Nestle or to somebody that might pollute it. But yeah, not necessarily related to the declaration from what I'm seeing, like in Virginia, for instance. I don't know that there's a lot of fossil fuel projects. I don't know if we can use the declaration against it, but we definitely highlight water.
Thank you. So we are at the top of the hour. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to a feedback form. As KB said at the beginning, this is the first time we've tried a state policy showcase, and we really want to do additional ones in the future. And your feedback will really help us figure out how to do those in a way that work for you. So please take a few minutes and fill that survey out. It'll really help us know where to take these state policy showcases in the future. And I also want to say a huge thank you to Jorge and Amanda for sharing your stories with us today. I know it takes a lot of time and effort to prepare presentations like you gave today. So we really appreciate the time that you took to prepare, the time you took to be here, and for all of your magnificent work that you're doing on behalf of your fellow neighbors in your states where you're working to help ensure the human right to water. And for all of you who are on the call today, we really appreciate all that you do as well, and the work that you're doing, and for being here today as well. We really hope that you'll join us for a future state policy showcase. Our next one is coming up in June, and it is on sewage right to know. So it's bills that are being passed around the country to allow people to know when sewage has been discharged into their local waterways. So I'll be sure to send you all a notification for that once you can register. I hope you'll join us again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.